Hey everybody, it's Tripl-L, and hey, welcome! Here we are to talk about Shokugeki no Soma Chapter 286, my very late impressions, but hey, spoilers have not come up for the next chapter, so I think we can still have a nice conversation about this. So to all the diehard fans who like watching these little videos, thanks for being here. Anyway, with Chapter 286, while we ultimately got a setup chapter, especially when you consider how it ended with Tsukasa and Soma deciding to have a bit of a mini challenge within their challenge, this chapter still offers quite a few things that we can sit down and talk about and even critique the writing going behind it, or even come up with arguments for why this is good writing and why this is bad writing. Or not bad writing, but has things lacking. Just because the author has given us a pretty nice scenario that is easier to critique. So that's what this video is going to be primarily about, and it's going to be pretty fun. It's not that often that we can have like these kind of conversations. Actually, well, you could argue with like recent Soma chapters this has been happening more often, but I'm very interested in just what's going on here. So a lot of it ultimately revolves around something that Takumi said during the chapter, and it's really right at the beginning, and that's specifically where he says that something is up with this year's blue. Even the challenges have got a few screws loosed, and then he goes on to say that up until the last year, I believe, the blue was a very predictable competition. So that's really important, because that by itself kind of it points out something that's going on with the blue, and it's just really interesting when you consider why it's happening. And when I say why it's happening, I'm not talking about within the logic of the Shokugeki no Soma world, but rather a lot of the things going on make more sense when you consider it from the perspective of an author who has to keep ramping up the excitement for his manga, right? So let's start deconstructing some of the things. We're going to begin with what we absolutely started off with first. I want to talk about the competitions that Takumi and Megumi got involved in. So Takumi had to do a competition, or he had to get, he got judged on a thing involving making food for kids. Meanwhile, Megumi had to make a food plan that was something that both dogs and their owner could enjoy. And we saw both people surrounded by dogs and the children, pretty much, right? Okay, so that's pretty cool. On the surface level, it tells you, okay, yeah, these are some pretty wacky challenges. Like, these seem like really challenging things to have to deal with. But let's break it down, because there is a fundamental difference between the competitions that Megumi and Takumi were involved in and Soma's particular challenge, right? Because when you look at the Takumi and Megumi ones, those revolve specifically around limitations. Takumi points it out in his little blurb that he had to avoid foods that could be allergens, and then since Megumi's dealing with animals, we know that there are quite a few foods that are toxic to dogs, so she's also dealing with limitations, whereas Soma didn't necessarily have to deal with limitations. As we saw with the Soma challenge, the conflict there, or the challenge there, revolved around what does a person think a dying man is suited to eat. And when you had people going in with the idea like you have to give him something just absolutely amazing, or you have to give him something that reminds him of home. The limitation in the Soma challenge wasn't this thing that Takumi and Megumi were being tested on. He was just being tested on a perspective, which you could argue, well, the perspective limits what people can make, but I would argue that Takumi and Megumi's challenges both required a chef to be smart and intelligent, smart enough to know what foods work for their respective clients, right? In this case, dogs and the babies, or the children. The big thing that I want to point out here is that Soma, compared to his two friends, had a fundamentally different challenge. And in that regard, you could start like talking, well, is that fair? Is that fair that these three people had, or rather Soma had to deal with a different criteria, or he was being tested on a different aspect compared to these other two? And then when you consider the story logic that this is a competition, you would say, well, no, a competition should properly try and be fair with how they are testing their competitors. And here, there is a fundamental distinction between the two. Again, Megumi and Takumi, their challenges require not only skill, but also knowledge of dangerous foods, whereas Soma's challenge didn't really require that. If you were to ask me who I think stands above with regards to these challenges, I would say that Takumi and Megumi are above Soma in the sense that they just cleared things that I think are technically more difficult than whatever Soma just cleared. Now, there is also the other thing to talk about, the fact that Soma was the one that got this particular competition. Now, we know from the writing perspective, we know that Soma ended up with this hardcore one because this had to be the one that introduced the noirs, or at least how the noirs think, right? There is this need that has to be kind of accomplished with Soma going through his first round. The author needs to establish specifically that Soma can contend with the noirs. But the thing here as well is that we have to look at what would have happened if Soma got one of those two other possibilities pretty much. How would the rhetoric with the noirs have changed? Because the big thing with that first one was that it was a competition that the noirs were more suited for, but I would have really have been curious to see noirs trying to justify why they're so much better at making dog food than the light side chefs. Because when you look at the other two competitions, you could have a situation, if you're a noir, you could say, oh yeah man, I always have to feed the attack dogs, or like, my boss is very in love with his dog, I have to make sure they both have the best meal possible. But it's like, okay, but that doesn't really change. That's not all that different from a light side chef being the personal chef for a guy who really loves his dog, right? That isn't all that different. Although the noir would probably say, like, because otherwise you might end up dying. And it's like, well, noir, if that's going to be the only thing that you have in your rhetoric to say why you're so much better than this guy, it's not going to work out. Similarly, when you have the child thing, the noir rhetoric that I could imagine would be something like, oh yeah, my boss has a wonderful daughter. You don't want to piss off the daughter. If you piss off the daughter, you get the daughter sick. You're going to end up with your head on the floor. And we noirs don't want that. So we make sure we know all the allergens. It's like, at the end of the day, if you apply the rhetoric of the noirs to those other competitions, it would have been easier to poke holes at than people who were on death row or people who were dying, right? But I would have liked to see it, because one of the big things that we were told when we went into this arc was that things were going to be different because they're allowing the noirs in. And so at the end of the day, those other two competitions, I don't think capture that noir spirit as well. Moving on with this idea of just the crazy challenges from the blue, before we go into the big one, another thing is just, questioning, why is the blue having such a crazy challenge now? The fact that the blue was a generic and predictable gourmet competition before this, honestly, that was very surprising to me, because I was being told that this thing was where the best of the best go. I thought that there would be some amazing challenges across all of the blues, because that's how it was sold to us. But we know as readers, the reason that the blue is so unpredictable right now is because it's in the Shokugeki no Soma and it's occurring at chapter 286, right? I would argue that this is a situation where the narrative requirements of the Shokugeki no Soma manga have shifted the logic of the Shokugeki no Soma world. And so when you're having this kind of situation where the needs of the narrative are outweighing the logic of the world, it's all about whether or not the author can write it in such a way that it feels natural. And to the author's credit, I don't think it's as bad as it could be. This is still a situation where I would like to have a few things a little bit more fleshed out, but the only thing that I find really silly in all of this is just the edginess of the noirs. But otherwise, things are fine, because we've been kind of conditioned to expect that Shokugeki no Soma is going to be crazy. So it's just very interesting. It's very interesting. We know that the blue ultimately got shifted like this because Soma's going to be in it. That's what caused it, and the author has given a good enough reason to justify that in story. Ultimately though, I do find a little bit of a disconnect with the blue in general. And I find it weird how the characters are reacting to it, because Takumi's saying that these challenges are weird and they've got a screw loose. And the thing that I'm just thinking on the inside, especially when you go to that last challenge, which is making a meal from cheap ingredients and making that worth $100, what I'm thinking is that the Totsuki alumni, especially if they're in the Elite 10, should all have innate advantages for this competition, because challenges have got a few screws loose totally describes the challenges that Soma has had to put up with throughout Totsuki. Or at least, look man, even considering the most recent Elite 10 challenge, which is just them making a shanty and making sure that they can sell so much money in a day. Like, when you consider the stuff that Totsuki throws at these kids, I'm surprised that they are even traumatized or worried about the blue competition. Because I'm just thinking, like, at the end of the chapter, you're telling me that Soma has to make a meal from cheap ingredients? You're telling me that's what he has to do? He's been doing that since the beginning. Soma's style revolves around using cheap foods in new and exciting ways. I find that so funny and so disconnected from the reality of the rest of the Shokugeki no Soma manga that you would present that as a challenge. And like, you know, you also have Megumi in there saying like, oh my god, that's going to be at the level of a high level French dish for $100 worth. And it's like, okay. Soma's worked with Shinomiya before. Megumi's been coached by Shinomiya before. Takumi worked in Italy, which I assume has good food. Look, you know, the author is trying to sell me on this idea. This is going to be hard. But the thematics of Soma and Soma's character and style makes me just think like, that's not inspiring all that much fear for me, right? And I do wonder if you guys, the readers, do you also have that kind of similar disconnect? Because again, when you read that final bit, it's just, this doesn't seem all that strange. And even though this is the blue, the pedigree of all big gourmet competitions, this just feels like another day in Shokugeki no Soma land. This is just another weird competition with some weird things that have to be done. I don't find this any more special than Soma having to go out into the woods and finding his ingredients to make something with. I don't find it any more special than the Elite 10 having to work and build a restaurant and then sell things out of that restaurant. I don't find it any more different than everyone scrambling for ingredients and then Megumi having to cook with older ingredients and making it work. I don't find it any more different than Soma trying to get the most out of a fish that was not initially the best quality ingredient. Like, this challenge is not different given the scope of the Shokugeki no Soma series. At the end of the day, these kids are amazing. They can do a lot. Like, the author has already sold us on that reality. So I find it funny. I find it funny how they're getting suspense out of this. That said, Tsukasa came back for this chapter. So I'm kind of sad when I saw Tsukasa, because I was kind of hoping that Akira and his group, including Alice, would be in that second gate. But seeing Tsukasa there, you know, I got a little bit disappointed. I now wonder, just because I was hoping for more people, I do wonder if Rindo or Megashima are also there, because Rindo has discovered new ingredients in the Amazon, and Megashima runs a pretty nice empire with his noodle cart. So it's just odd that Soma and Megumi and Takumi get invited, but Rindo doesn't, right? It's still in that odd area. So I am interested to see what happens in the next chapter, because it's still possible those characters are still here. It was just we haven't seen them yet. So it's one of those things. Overall though, guys, let me know what you thought down below. And I'm going to end it there. Till next time, I hope you have an absolutely great day. But like I just want to again say, like, I find this just very interesting with Soma. Anyway, yeah, that's it for me. Till next time. Bye bye.